The Black Hawk's rotors were still spinning when Lieutenant Sarah Martinez watched 3 helicopters disappear into smoke plumes on the horizon. The radio crackled with static and desperate voices calling for medevac, calling for backup, calling for anyone who could fly. She pressed her palm against the bulletproof glass of the operations center window, her breath fogging the surface as explosions lit up the Afghan mountainside like deadly fireworks. "Martinez, get Colonel Harrison on." "The line," barked Major Reynolds, his voice cutting through the chaos of the command post. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning that fought against the desert heat. "We need those supply drops now, or Bravo Company won't make it through the night." Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, her dark eyes reflecting the glow of multiple monitors, showing satellite feeds, troop movements, and casualty reports. For 18 months, she had been the administrative backbone of Forward Operating Base Coast, the woman who scheduled briefings, filed reports, and made sure the coffee was strong enough to keep exhausted officers functioning. The men called her just the secretary, with a mixture of dismissal and grudging respect. Dismissal because she wore the uniform but never carried a rifle into combat. Respect because she somehow made their impossible logistics work, but Sarah Martinez hadn't. Always sat behind a desk. Before the Army reassigned her to administrative duties, she had logged over 800 flight hours in Black Hawks during her pilot training at Fort Rucker. Before a training accident that left her with a slight tremor in her left hand, barely visible. Unless you knew to look for it, she had been on track to join the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers. The tremor wasn't enough to ground her completely, but it was enough to redirect her career towards safer assignments. Safer, they said, as if any place in Afghanistan was truly safe. As if the rockets that hit the base every Tuesday didn't care whether you were flying or filing papers. "Ma'am," Specialist Johnson approached her desk, his young face pale beneath his desert tan. "The colonel's not responding. None of the senior pilots are. The Taliban hit the pilots' quarters with mortar 20 minutes ago." His voice cracked. "Slightly. Captain Williams is in surgery. Major Hendricks. He didn't make it out." The words hit Sarah like ice water. She stood slowly, her chair rolling backward as she processed the implications. In the space of one mortar attack, Phobe Coast had lost its most experienced pilots. The remaining aviators were either wounded, on missions they couldn't abandon, or trapped in distant outposts waiting for extraction. Major Reynolds spun around, his face a mask of controlled panic. "What do you mean none of them are responding?" "Sir, medical says it'll be at least 6 hours before anyone's cleared to fly." "Maybe longer." Johnson's hands shook as he held his tablet. "Bravo Company is pinned down 15 clicks north. They've got wounded, and the Taliban is moving in heavy weapons. Without resupply." The sentence hung unfinished in the air, but everyone knew how it ended. Without resupply, good soldiers would die. Sarah had processed enough casualty reports to know that Kier wasn't just letters on a form, it was someone's son, someone's husband, someone who would never make it home. To the life they'd left behind, she walked to the window again, watching the mechanics prep another Black Hawk on the tarmac. The helicopter sat there like a sleeping beast, rotors folded, waiting for someone with the skill and authorization to bring it to life. The irony wasn't lost on her, surrounded by millions of dollars of aviation equipment, and no one qualified to fly it when it mattered most. "Martinez," Major Reynolds called, and she could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. "Get me anyone. National Guard, Allied Forces, hell, call the Air Force and see if they've got anyone who can transition to rotary wing." Sarah turned from the window, her mind racing through possibilities. The nearest Allied aviation units were hours away. The Air Force pilots they could reach were fixed-wing only. Every option would take too long, and Bravo Company didn't have hours to spare. "Sir," she said quietly, "I can fly it." The command post went silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant thump of artillery. Major Reynolds stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "Martinez, this isn't a video game. Those boys need, I have 847 hours. In UH-60s, sir. I was pilot qualified before my reassignment." Her voice was steady, professional, but inside her chest, her heart hammered against her ribs. "I can get them their supplies." Major Reynolds shook his head. "You're admin. You haven't flown combat missions. The insurance alone." "With respect, sir," Sarah interrupted. Something she'd never done in 18 months of following orders without question. "Insurance doesn't matter if they're dead, and I wasn't admin in flight school. I was top 10% of my class." Sergeant First Class Martinez, not related. Despite the shared name, stepped forward from his position at the communications array. Miguel Martinez had been watching Sarah work for over a year, had seen her coordinate impossible logistics, had noticed the way she sometimes stared at the helicopters with something that looked like longing. "Major, she's right about her qualifications. I pulled her file when she first arrived, thought we might be related." He gestured towards Sarah with something like admiration. "She washed out of SOAR selection not because she couldn't fly, but because of a medical issue that's probably not even relevant anymore." Sarah shot him a grateful look, though washed out stung more than she cared to admit. She hadn't washed out, she'd been redirected. There was a difference, even if the end result looked the same on paper. Major Reynolds ran his hands through his graying hair, a gesture Sarah had seen him make countless times during their twice-daily briefings. He was a good officer, the kind who genuinely cared about his soldiers, but he was also the kind who followed regulations and protocols because they existed for good reasons. "The liability, Martinez. If something happens..." "Sir," Sarah said, stepping closer to his desk, "something is already happening. To our soldiers, to Bravo Company. And we're the only ones who can do anything about it." Through the operations center's speakers, another radio transmission crackled to life. Any station, this is Bravo 6. We are taking heavy fire. Casualties mounting. Request immediate resupply and medevac." "How copy?" the voice belonged to Captain Morrison, Sarah realized. She'd typed up his commendation paperwork just last week, something about leading his men through an ambush with no casualties. Now he was calling for help that might not come. Major Reynolds closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, Sarah saw the decision there before he spoke. "Martinez, if you get yourself killed, I'm going to have you court-martialed." His attempt at humor fell flat, but Sarah understood what he was really saying. "Johnson, get her a flight suit and a helmet." Martinez Miguel prepped the bird and brief her on current threats. Sarah felt her legs go slightly weak with relief and terror in equal measure. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd dreamed of, what she'd lost the chance to do. And now, when it mattered most, she was getting that chance back. But as she headed toward the equipment lockers, pulling on the flight suit that smelled like JP-8 fuel and other people's sweat, she caught her reflection in a mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't the confident pilot candidate from Fort Rucker. This was Administrative Specialist Martinez, the secretary who filed reports and answered phones and made sure meeting rooms were booked correctly. The tremor in her left hand was barely visible, but she could feel it. Would feel it on the controls. Would have to compensate for it every second she was in the air. Sergeant Martinez appeared beside her with a helmet and survival vest. "Ma'am, I've been crew chief on 67 combat missions. I know pilots, and I know bullshit." He handed her the gear with steady hands. "You're not bullshit. How can you tell?" Sarah asked, adjusting the helmet's weight on her head. "Because every real pilot I've met looks at helicopters the way you do, like they're alive. Like they're waiting for you." He paused, then added, "And because scared pilots are careful pilots. Overconfident ones get people killed." As Sarah walked toward the Black Hawk, the desert wind caught her hair beneath the helmet, and for a moment she felt 17 again. Standing on the tarmac at Fort Rucker, watching her first instructor demonstrate an auto-rotation landing, the same mixture of terror and excitement, the same sense that she was about to do something that would change her forever. The helicopter looked different up close, bigger and more complex than she remembered from her training days. Every rivet, every panel, every instrument had a purpose, and in a few minutes, all of that purpose would depend on her ability to remember 3 years of training she'd been forced to set aside. Miguel Martinez was already performing his pre-flight inspection, checking fluid levels and control linkages with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. "Ma'am, weather's holding, but intel says we might have small arms fire along the route. Maybe some RPGs if we're unlucky." Sarah nodded, running through emergency procedures in her mind. Auto-rotation landings, engine failures, hydraulic malfunction scenarios she'd practiced in simulators, but never faced with lives depending on her decisions. "One more thing, ma'am," Miguel said, his voice softer now. "My cousin was in Bravo Company. Got transferred out last month. These aren't just names on a roster. They're someone's family." Sarah understood. She'd been filing casualty reports for 18 months typing up letters that would be delivered to families who would never be the same. Tonight, for the first time, she had the chance to prevent one of those letters from being written. As she settled into the pilot's seat, her hands moving automatically through the startup sequence, Sarah Martinez stopped being just the secretary. The woman who had spent 18 months scheduling meetings and organizing files was still there, but she was joined by someone else, the pilot she'd trained to be, the aviator she'd never stopped being in her heart, the engine spooled up with a rising whine that she felt in her bones. The controls came alive in her hands, familiar despite the years away. And as the Black Hawk lifted off from Phobe Coast, carrying supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for Bravo Company, Sarah realized that everything she'd done, every report filed, every meeting scheduled, every day spent behind a desk had been preparing her for this moment. The night sky opened before them, star-filled and dangerous, and Sarah Martinez flew into it carrying more than just supplies. She carried the hopes of soldiers who needed someone to come for them, the weight of a career that had taken an unexpected turn, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important moments come disguised as routine days that suddenly become anything but routine. Behind them, Phobe Coast grew smaller in the darkness, but ahead lay the mountains where Bravo Company waited, where Taliban fighters watched the sky, and where a secretary-turned-pilot would discover exactly who she was meant to be. The Black Hawk cut through the Afghan night like a prayer seeking an answer, its rotors beating a rhythm that Sarah felt in her chest cavity. At 5,000 feet, the world below looked deceptively peaceful, scattered lights from remote compounds, the silver thread of rivers catching moonlight, mountains that rolled away toward Pakistan like sleeping giants. But Sarah knew better than to trust the peaceful appearance. She'd read too many intelligence reports, typed too many after-action summaries, to believe that darkness meant safety. Her left hand maintained pressure on the collective, and she was grateful that the slight tremor that had derailed her original flight career was barely noticeable now. Adrenaline, it seemed, was an effective medication. Her right hand worked the cyclic with a precision that surprised her. Muscle memory was a powerful thing, apparently undiminished by 3 years of administrative duties. "Coast Base, this is Dustoff 77, approaching Checkpoint Alpha." She transmitted, using the medical evacuation call sign, because it was the first one that came to mind. In the chaos of the emergency launch, nobody had bothered to assign her a proper mission call sign. "Roger, Dustoff 77. Be advised, heavy activity in your AO. Bravo 6 reports Taliban movement along ridge lines." Sarah's stomach tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Copy all. ETA to Bravo's position 15 minutes. Behind her, Sergeant Martinez Miguel. She reminded herself was checking the supply bundles one final time. Medical supplies, ammunition, food, and water. The essentials that would keep 23 soldiers alive through the night and into tomorrow. 23 men who right now were probably listening for the sound of rotor blades, hoping someone was coming for them. The irony wasn't lost on her that for 18 months, she'd been the one coordinating these missions from the safety of the operations center. She'd been the voice on the radio saying, "Roger, mission approved," or "Negative, weather's too dangerous." Now she was the one flying into the danger, and the perspective was entirely different. Every decision felt heavier when you were the one who would live or die by its consequences. Sarah had grown up in Tucson, Arizona, where her father worked as an aircraft mechanic at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. She'd spent her childhood watching A-10 Warthogs practice their ground attack runs, listening to her father explain the difference between turboprops and turbojets, learning that aircraft weren't just machines, but carefully balanced compromises between competing forces. Lift versus weight, thrust versus drag, power versus fuel consumption. Her father, Roberto Martinez, had emigrated from Mexico when he was 12, carrying nothing but a fierce determination to build something better for his future family. He'd worked his way through community college while supporting his parents, earned his aircraft mechanic certification, and eventually became one of the most trusted maintenance supervisors on the base. Sarah had inherited his mechanical intuition and his stubborn refusal to accept that something couldn't be done. "Mia," he used to say, watching her take apart radios and small engines just to see how they worked. The difference between fixing something and breaking it is paying attention. Always pay attention. She was paying attention now. The helicopter's vibration patterns, the sound of the engines, the feel of the controls, all of it was information that could keep her alive. The Black Hawk was running smoothly, but Sarah knew that could change in an instant. Mechanical failures, enemy fire, whether any number of things could turn a routine supply, run into a survival situation. Sarah had joined the Army not because she needed the money or the benefits, but because she wanted to serve something larger than herself. Growing up as the daughter of an immigrant, she'd understood from an early age that freedom wasn't free, that someone had to be willing to defend the ideals that made America worth defending. Her high school guidance counselor had suggested college, and then maybe law school. Her mother had hoped she'd become a teacher or a nurse, something safe, something that would let her come home every night. But Sarah had wanted to fly. Flight school at Fort Rucker had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, and also the most rewarding. The academic phases were manageable. She'd always been good with textbooks and tests. The practical flying was where she discovered something about herself that she hadn't known existed. In the cockpit of a helicopter, all the scattered pieces of her personality seemed to come together into something focused and capable. Her instructors had been impressed with her ability to multitask, to manage the complex dance of collective, cyclic, and anti-torque pedals while simultaneously navigating, communicating on the radio, and monitoring engine parameters. Flying a helicopter wasn't like driving a car, where you could get comfortable and let your mind wander. It demanded constant attention, constant small corrections, constant awareness of how every control input affected the aircraft's behavior. Martinez shows exceptional situational awareness and aircraft control, her primary instructor had written in her evaluation. Recommend for advanced training with special operations aviation. That recommendation had led to SOAR selection, the grueling process that separated pilots who were merely good from pilots who were exceptional. Sarah had made it through the physical fitness requirements, the psychological evaluations, the academic phases. She'd been 3 weeks away from earning her Night Stalker wings when the training accident happened. It hadn't been her fault, not really. During the formation flying exercise, another student pilot had suffered a hydraulic failure and made an emergency auto-rotation, landing in a field that turned out to be softer than it looked. His helicopter had rolled over, and Sarah, flying close formation behind him, had been forced to make an emergency landing in the same field to provide assistance. Her landing had been textbook perfect, but when she'd tried to lift off after confirming the other crew was safe, her helicopter had settled unexpectedly. Nothing dangerous, just a momentary loss of lift that required a quick collective pull to recover. But the sudden sharp control input had stressed her left wrist, and when the adrenaline wore off later that day, she'd noticed the slight tremor. The flight surgeons had been thorough in their evaluation. The tremor was minor, barely visible, probably caused by minor nerve damage that would likely heal over time. But probably and likely weren't good enough for special operations aviation. SOAR required perfection, and even the possibility of a control issue was enough to disqualify her. "It's not fair," she'd said to the flight surgeon, a kind woman who'd clearly delivered this news before. "It doesn't affect my flying at all." "I know," the doctor had replied. "But fair isn't the standard we use. Safety is, and special operations missions don't allow for any margin of error." So Sarah had been reassigned to administrative duties, a career path that made use of her organizational skills and attention to detail but left her grounded permanently. She'd accepted the decision with outward grace and inward bitterness, throwing herself into her new role with the same intensity she'd once applied to flying. For 3 years, she'd been the perfect administrator. Efficient, reliable, unflappable under pressure. She'd turned the chaotic paperwork systems at Phobe Coast into models of organization. She'd streamlined the scheduling process for briefings and meetings. She'd created databases that made it easier to track everything from supply inventories to personnel records. But late at night, alone in her small quarters, she'd sometimes pull out her old flight manuals and study them by flashlight. She'd practice emergency procedures in her mind, running through scenarios she might never face again. She'd listen to the helicopters taking off and landing, and imagine herself at the controls. Now, flying through hostile airspace towards soldiers who needed her help. Sarah realized that all those nights of secret studying had been preparing her for exactly this moment. The procedures were still there, buried under 3 years of administrative routine, but not forgotten. Her hands moved across the controls with something that felt like recognition, as if they remembered what they'd been trained to do. "Dust off 7-7, this is Bravo 6, the radio crackled. "We have you on thermal. Advise you that we're taking sporadic sniper fire from the East Ridge. LZ is cold for now, but that could change fast." Sarah's mouth went dry, but her voice remained steady. "Roger, Bravo 6. Can you mark the LZ?" "Negative. Dust off. IR strobes would give away our position. You'll have to come in dark." Landing in a potentially hostile area without proper marking was one of the scenarios. Sarah had practiced dozens of times in training, but training and reality were different things. In training, the worst that could happen was a failed grade and a chance to try again. Here, failure meant people died. "Copy, Bravo 6. Coming in from the west, low approach." Sarah began her descent, dropping the Black Hawk down toward the valley floor where Bravo Company waited. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a fortress, and she was acutely aware that dozens of Taliban fighters could be watching them approach, waiting for the right moment to open fire. Her left hand was steady on the collective, the tremor that had ended her original flying career completely absent now. Fear, it turned out, was excellent medicine for minor nerve issues. Her right hand worked the cyclic with delicate precision, making the tiny adjustments necessary to maintain their approach path in the turbulent air near the mountains. "Ma'am," Miguel's voice came through the intercom, "I've got movement on the Fonda Ridge line. Could be Taliban spotters." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but her flying remained smooth. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd dreamed of, what she'd thought she'd lost forever. The chance to use her skills when they mattered most, when lives depended on her ability to put the helicopter exactly where it needed to be. Below them, the landing zone materialized out of the darkness, a small clearing barely large enough for a Black Hawk, surrounded by rocks and scrub brush that could hide enemy fighters. Sarah began her final approach, her entire world narrowing to the few square meters where she needed to place the aircraft. The helicopter settled toward the ground with the delicate precision of a hummingbird, landing on a flower. Sarah felt the wheels touch earth, felt the weight of the aircraft transfer from her controls to the landing gear, felt the satisfaction of a perfect landing executed under the worst possible conditions. Bravo 6, Dustoff 77 is on the ground, she transmitted, beginning offload now. Through her night vision goggles, she could see soldiers emerging from concealed positions around the landing zone. They moved with the practiced efficiency of combat veterans, forming a security perimeter while others began unloading the precious supplies from the Black Hawk's cargo bay. Captain Morrison, Bravo Company's commander, appeared at her window. He was younger than she'd expected, probably not even 30, but his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much combat. "Ma'am, we've got wounded that need to go back with you. Can you take them?" Sarah glanced at Miguel, who was already reconfiguring the cargo bay to accommodate litters. "How many?" "3 critical, 2 walking wounded. Load them up, but make it fast. This LZ won't stay cold forever." As the wounded soldiers were carefully loaded into the helicopter, Sarah found herself thinking about the reports she'd filed over the past 18 months. Casualty reports, medical evacuation summaries, letters of commendation for acts of valor. All of those documents had been abstractions to her, administrative tasks that needed to be completed accurately and efficiently. Now she was seeing the human reality behind the paperwork. The critical patients were barely conscious, kept alive by the skill of their unit's medic and their own stubborn will to survive. The walking wounded tried to help with the loading despite their injuries, because that's what soldiers did. They took care of each other. "Ma'am, we're loaded," Miguel reported, "ready for takeoff." Sarah began the startup sequence, her hands moving through the familiar pattern of switches and controls. The Black Hawk lifted off from the improvised landing zone just as muzzle flashes began winking from the eastern ridgeline. Small arms fire, probably AK-47s, the distinctive sound of enemy weapons that every American soldier learned to recognize. Taking fire, taking fire. Miguel called out, but Sarah was already climbing aggressively, using the Black Hawk's power to get them above the effective range of small arms as quickly as possible. A few rounds pinged off the helicopter's armored hull, but nothing that sounded like critical damage. Dustoff 77, Bravo 6, nice work getting in and out clean. Those supplies are going to keep us in the fight. Roger, Bravo 6, stay safe out there. As they climbed toward a safer altitude, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced. In 3 years, the satisfaction of using her skills for their intended purpose. She wasn't just a secretary who happened to know how to fly. She was a pilot who had temporarily been assigned to administrative duties, and now she was doing what pilots do, bringing people home. The wounded soldiers behind her were alive because she'd been able to land in a hostile zone and take off again before the enemy could organize an effective response. The soldiers still on the ground had the supplies they needed to survive the night because she'd been willing to fly a mission that no one else could take. Her father had been right about paying attention, but there was more to it than that. Success came from being ready when opportunity presented itself, from maintaining your skills even when it seemed like you'd never use them again, from being willing to step up when someone needed you to be more than what your job description said you were supposed to be. The emergency room at Bagram Airfield operated under harsh fluorescent lights that never dimmed, creating a perpetual artificial day where exhausted medical personnel moved between gurneys with the mechanical precision of people who'd seen too much trauma. Sarah Martinez stood in the hallway outside the treatment bay where the 3 critical patients from Bravo Company were fighting for their lives, still wearing her flight suit, helmet tucked under her arm like a talisman from another world. Doctor Jennifer Walsh, the chief trauma surgeon, emerged from behind the curtain with blood on her surgical scrubs and fatigue etched into the lines around her eyes. She was a Navy commander who'd spent the last 8 months patching together soldiers who arrived on helicopters just like the one Sarah had flown. "All 3 are going to make it," Dr. Walsh said without preamble. "The kid with the chest wound will need surgery in Germany, but he's stable. The other 2 should be back with their unit in a couple weeks, assuming they want to go back." Sarah felt tension leave her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Thank you, ma'am. They're good soldiers." "They all are." Dr. Walsh studied Sarah with the clinical attention she usually reserved for patients. "Miguel Martinez tells me you haven't flown combat missions before tonight. That true?" "Yes, ma'am. I've been on administrative duties for the past 3 years. Well, your administrative duties just saved 3 lives. Maybe more, counting the soldiers who didn't get shot because Bravo Company had the supplies they needed to maintain their position." Dr. Walsh paused, then added, "You should know that word about tonight is already spreading. Combat pilots are a small community, and they talk." Sarah wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a warning. In her experience, military communities could be supportive or ruthlessly judgmental, sometimes both simultaneously. Being the subject of conversation wasn't necessarily something to celebrate. The flight back to Phobe Coast had been routine, but Sarah's mind had been anything but calm. She'd replayed every moment of the mission, analyzing her decisions, second-guessing her techniques, wondering if she'd gotten lucky or if she'd actually performed well under pressure. The tremor in her left hand had been completely absent during the flight, but now standing in the sterile hospital corridor, she could feel it returning. Major Reynolds appeared in the hallway, looking more awake than he had any right to at 3 in the morning. "Martinez, we need to debrief while the details are still fresh. How do you feel about the mission?" "Successful, sir. Minimal enemy contact, all objectives achieved, patients delivered in stable condition. That's the official version." "I want to hear the pilot's version." Sarah considered her words carefully. "Sir, the helicopter performed well. The crew did their jobs professionally. The soldiers on the ground were brave as hell, and everyone came home alive. From a pilot's perspective, that's about as good as it gets." Major Reynolds nodded, but Sarah could see he was wrestling with something. "Martinez, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Tonight was an emergency situation. We had no choice but to bend some rules. But if I offered you the chance to return to flight status permanently, would you want it?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 3 years, she'd told herself that she'd made peace with her administrative role, that she'd found satisfaction in supporting the mission from behind a desk. But standing here in her flight suit, with the smell of JP-8 fuel still in her hair and the memory of rotor blade vibrations still in her bones, she realized she'd been lying to herself. "Sir, my medical records show." "I asked what you wanted, not what your medical records show." Major Reynolds' voice was gentler than usual. "Medical standards can be reviewed. Policies can be reconsidered. What I need to know is whether you want to be a pilot or whether you want to be an administrator who can fly in emergencies." Before Sarah could answer, Sergeant Miguel Martinez appeared in the hallway, looking troubled. "Ma'am, sir, we need to talk. I just got word from the night duty officer. There's been some chatter about tonight's mission." "What kind of chatter?" Major Reynolds asked. "The kind where people are asking questions about authorization and liability, and who approved a desk jockey to fly a combat mission." Miguel's expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could hear the anger beneath his professional tone. Apparently some folks think tonight was about glory-seeking instead of saving lives. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She'd been expecting congratulations, maybe a commendation, possibly even a chance to return to flight status. She hadn't considered that some people might view her actions as reckless showboating rather than necessary initiative. "Who's asking?" "Questions?" Major Reynolds demanded. "Lieutenant Colonel Harrison from Division. He's requesting a full investigation into the mission approval process and the decision to use unqualified personnel for combat operations." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. Unqualified personnel. After 18 months of flawless administrative performance, after a successful combat mission that saved lives, she was being reduced to unqualified personnel by officers who'd probably never made a decision more challenging than which briefing room to book for their morning meeting. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "if my actions last night were inappropriate, I take full responsibility. Major Reynolds acted properly under emergency conditions, and any criticism should be directed at me." "Like hell," Major Reynolds snapped. "Martinez, you flew a perfect mission under impossible conditions. Any investigation is going to show that you saved American lives when no one else was available to do it. If Division wants to second-guess emergency decisions made in combat conditions, they can explain to the families of Bravo Company why their sons came home alive, despite the best efforts of some bureaucrats to prevent it." But Sarah knew military politics better than that. She'd been filing reports and managing correspondence long enough to understand that perception often mattered more than reality, that careers could be destroyed by investigations even when those investigations eventually cleared the accused. The fact that she'd performed well was less important than the fact that she'd operated outside normal procedures. Over the next several days, Sarah found herself caught in a bureaucratic whirlwind that made actual combat seem straightforward. By comparison, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison arrived at Phobe Coast with a team of investigators who interviewed everyone connected to the mission. They examined maintenance records, reviewed flight procedures, analyzed communications transcripts, and generally treated Sarah's life-saving flight as if it were a criminal conspiracy. The investigation was thorough and professional, but the underlying assumption was clear. Someone had screwed up, and that someone was probably Sarah Martinez. The investigators were polite, but skeptical when she explained her qualifications. They took careful notes when she described her decision-making process during the flight. They asked detailed questions about her medical history and her administrative duties, as if being good at filing reports somehow disqualified her from flying helicopters. Captain Morrison from Bravo Company drove down from his remote outpost to testify on Sarah's behalf. He arrived dusty and exhausted from days of continuous operations, but his testimony was unequivocal. "Ma'am, without that resupply mission, we would have been overrun," he told the investigation board. "My soldiers were down to their last magazines. We had wounded men who needed medical attention, and the Taliban was moving heavy weapons into position for a final assault. Specialist Martinez didn't just deliver supplies. She gave us the means to hold our position and complete our mission." The wounded soldiers from Bravo Company submitted written statements from their hospital beds in Germany. Specialist Johnson, the young soldier who'd been shot in the chest, dictated a letter that read in part, "The pilot who flew us out of there saved my life. I don't care what her job description says. She's a hero, and anyone who says different wasn't there." But for every statement supporting Sarah, there seemed to be another questioning the precedent her actions had set. What if other administrative personnel decided they were qualified for combat roles? What if the next emergency resulted in disaster because someone overestimated their abilities? What about liability, insurance, chain of command, proper procedures? The questions multiplied like bacteria in a petri dish, each one spawning new concerns and complications. Sarah found herself defending not just her actions on a single night, but the entire concept of initiative and improvisation in combat situations. "The regulation is clear," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said, during one particularly contentious interview. Flight operations must be conducted by personnel who meet current medical and training standards. Specialist Martinez had been medically disqualified from flight duties. Her administrative position did not authorize her to pilot aircraft. "Sir," Sarah replied, "the regulation also says that commanders have the authority to make emergency decisions to preserve life and complete the mission." Major Reynolds exercised that authority under combat conditions. Major Reynolds exceeded his authority when he authorized unqualified personnel to operate military aircraft. The fact that the mission succeeded doesn't justify the violation of established procedures. And there it was, the fundamental disagreement that would determine Sarah's future. Did results justify means? Did saving lives excuse procedural violations? Was initiative to be celebrated or punished? Sarah began to understand that this investigation wasn't really about her flight qualifications or her medical status. It was about the larger question of how much flexibility commanders should have in combat situations, and whether the military valued adaptability or adherence to regulations more highly. The answer came in stages, like a slowly developing photograph, revealing an unwelcome image. First, Sarah was removed from flight status pending the completion of the investigation. Then she was reassigned to a different administrative position, one that had no connection to aviation operations. Finally, she received formal counseling about the importance of staying within her assigned role and responsibilities. The counseling session was conducted by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison himself, in a small office that smelled like disinfectant and disappointment. He was a thin man with graying hair and the soft hands of someone who'd spent more time behind desks than in cockpits, but his uniform displayed the wings of a senior aviator and the ribbons of someone who'd served with distinction. "Specialist Martinez," he began, reading from a prepared statement, "while your intentions were commendable and your actions resulted in a successful mission, you violated established procedures and exceeded your authorized duties. This counseling is intended to ensure that you understand the importance of operating within your assigned role and responsibilities." Sarah sat at attention, her hands folded in her lap, watching Lieutenant Colonel Harrison deliver what felt like a prepared obituary for her military career. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being counseled for saving lives by an officer whose most dangerous recent decision had probably been choosing between regular and decaffeinated coffee. In the division headquarters, "Sir," she said when he paused, "I understand the importance of following procedures. But I also understand the importance of completing the mission and bringing soldiers home alive. When those two priorities conflict, I believe the mission should take precedence." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison looked up from his statement, and for a moment Sarah saw something unexpected in his eyes, not disapproval, but something that looked almost like envy. "Specialist Martinez, I've been flying helicopters for 22 years. I've commanded aviation units, trained new pilots, written policy, and sat on promotion boards. And in all that time, I've never had the opportunity to do what you did that night." The admission hung in the air between them like an unexploded bomb. Sarah realized that Lieutenant Colonel Harrison wasn't just investigating her actions, he was confronting the gap between the career he'd built and the career he'd probably dreamed of having. "But," he continued, returning to his prepared statement, "the military operates on discipline and adherence to established procedures. Individual initiative, while admirable, cannot be allowed to supersede institutional authority. Your actions set a precedent that could encourage others to exceed their authorized duties with potentially catastrophic results." The formal counseling concluded with Sarah signing a statement acknowledging that she understood her role and responsibilities and promising to operate within her assigned duties in the future. It was a bureaucratic band-aid applied to a wound that went much deeper than procedural violations, but the real damage wasn't done in official counseling sessions or investigation reports. It was done in the small moments that followed, the subtle changes in how people treated her, the gradual erosion of the respect she'd built over 18 months of exemplary administrative performance. Some of the administrative staff began treating her differently, as if her brief return to flying had somehow contaminated her ability to file reports and schedule meetings. Captain Williams, the logistics officer who'd been recovered from surgery, made pointed comments about people who couldn't stay in their lanes. Other officers avoided her altogether, as if association with someone who'd been investigated might somehow damage their own careers. The isolation was subtle but comprehensive. Sarah found herself eating meals alone, sitting in empty briefing rooms, walking the base perimeter during her off-duty hours because the officers' club had become uncomfortably quiet whenever she entered. She'd gone from being an integral part of the team to being a cautionary tale about the dangers of initiative. Miguel Martinez, the crew chief who'd flown with her that night, found her sitting alone in the maintenance hangar one evening, staring at the Black Hawk they'd flown to save. Bravo Company. The helicopter looked ordinary under the harsh fluorescent lights. Just another piece of military equipment waiting for its next mission. "Ma'am," he said, settling onto a crate beside her improvised bench, "I've been thinking about what happened, and I've got something to say." "Miguel, you don't need to." "Yes, ma'am, I do. I've flown with a lot of pilots, and most of them are good at their jobs. They know the procedures. They can execute the mission profiles. They get from point A to point B safely and efficiently." He paused, looking at the helicopter. "But that night, you weren't just a pilot. You were something more." Sarah felt tears. Threatening, which surprised her. She'd maintained her composure through the investigation, the counseling, the gradual social exile. But Miguel's words touched something raw that she'd been trying to ignore. "I don't feel like something more," she admitted. "I feel like someone who screwed up her career for one night of glory." "Ma'am, with respect, that's bullshit." Miguel's voice was gentle but firm. "Glory would have been flying the mission and then bragging about it to everyone who'd listen. What you did was fly the mission and then accept responsibility for the consequences. That's not glory, that's leadership." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Morrison, who'd driven down from his outpost again, this time alone and after dark. He looked tired and worried, the kind of expression that meant more bad news was coming. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "I need to talk to you about something, and I'm not sure you're going to like it." Sarah braced herself for another investigation. Another round of questions. Another opportunity to explain why she'd chosen to save lives instead of following procedures. "It's about Bravo Company," Captain Morrison continued. "We've been having problems with our regular supply runs. Someone at division level has been questioning every mission request, demanding additional justification, requiring extra approvals. What used to take 20 minutes now takes 4 hours, and sometimes the approval doesn't come at all." Sarah felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach. "They're making an example." "Yes, ma'am. They're showing everyone what happens when units operate outside normal channels. My men are back to rationing ammunition and medical supplies, not because the resources aren't available, but because someone wants to prove a point about following proper procedures." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. The same soldiers who'd benefited from Sarah's emergency flight were now being punished for it, their supply lines artificially constrained to demonstrate the importance of bureaucratic compliance. It was collective punishment disguised as administrative efficiency. "Captain, is there anything I can do?" "Ma'am, honestly, I think your involvement would make things worse. Right now, Bravo Company is associated with the investigation. If you started advocating for us, it would just confirm what some people already think, that we're troublemakers who don't respect proper authority." Sarah nodded, understanding the impossible position Captain Morrison was in. He needed to distance himself from her in order to protect his soldiers, even though those soldiers owed their lives to her willingness to break the rules. as Captain Morrison left the hangar. Sarah realized that her actions had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond her own career. The investigation hadn't just questioned her judgment. It had created a climate of fear where initiative was discouraged, and strict compliance was the only safe path forward. But the worst was yet to come. 3 days later, Sarah received orders, transferring her to a supply depot in Kuwait, effective immediately. The transfer was described as a routine administrative reassignment, but everyone understood what it really meant. She was being exiled, removed from the combat theater, sent to count inventory in a warehouse where her flying skills would be completely irrelevant. The night before her departure, Major Reynolds found her in her quarters, packing her few personal belongings into a standard military duffel bag. He looked older than he had a month ago, worn down by the bureaucratic battle he'd fought and lost on her behalf. "Martinez, I want you to know that I've submitted a recommendation for you to receive a commendation for your actions that night. I don't know if it will be approved, but it's in the system." "Sir, I appreciate that, but no, listen to me. What happened to you is wrong. What's happening to Bravo Company is wrong. The whole damn investigation was wrong." Major Reynolds sat heavily in the small chair beside her desk. But sometimes the system protects itself more than it protects the people who serve it. Sarah zipped her duffel bag closed, the sound final and decisive. "Sir, do you regret approving the mission?" Major Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small window at the flight line where helicopters sat waiting for their next missions. "Martinez, I've been in the Army for 16 years. I've made thousands of decisions, approved hundreds of missions, sent good soldiers into harm's way more times than I can count. Most of those decisions were routine, by the book, exactly what any competent officer would have done." He turned to look at her directly. "But that night, when Bravo Company needed help and no one else could provide it, I made a decision that mattered. I chose to trust your abilities over my career security. And because of that decision, American soldiers came home alive." He paused. "So no, I don't regret it. I regret that the system punished you for being exceptional, but I don't regret the decision that gave you the chance to be exceptional." The next morning, Sarah Martinez boarded a transport flight to Kuwait, leaving behind the mountains of Afghanistan, the helicopter she'd trained to fly, and the soldiers she'd served alongside. She carried with her a damaged career, a stack of administrative citations, and the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing was indistinguishable from doing the wrong thing, depending on who was keeping score. As the aircraft climbed away from Fob Coast, Sarah looked down at the flight line where Black Hawk sat ready for their next missions. Somewhere down there, Miguel Martinez was probably performing pre-flight inspections, preparing to fly with another pilot on another mission. Somewhere in the mountains, Bravo Company was making do with limited supplies, while bureaucrats debated the proper procedures for keeping them alive. And somewhere, in Division Headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was probably filing another report about the importance of following established procedures, secure in the knowledge that he'd successfully discouraged the kind of dangerous initiative that might save lives but violated proper authority. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember what it had felt like to fly through the Afghan night with purpose and skill, carrying supplies to soldiers who needed them and bringing wounded men home to their families. That memory would have to sustain her through whatever came next, because it might be the last time she'd ever feel truly useful in uniform. The warehouse in Kuwait was a monument to military efficiency, containing everything from MREs to vehicle parts, organized in precise rows that stretched toward a ceiling lost in shadows. Sarah Martinez spent her days checking inventory levels, processing requisition forms, and ensuring that serial numbers matched paperwork tasks that utilized perhaps 10% of her capabilities and none of her training. It was administrative purgatory disguised as a necessary assignment. For 6 months, She'd been counting boxes and filing reports while her flight skills slowly atrophied from disuse. The tremor in her left hand had returned, more pronounced now, as if her body was rebelling against the enforced inactivity. She'd requested permission to maintain her flight currency through simulator training, but the request had been denied. Pilots on administrative hold weren't authorized for training flights. The irony was suffocating. She'd been grounded for violating procedures that had saved lives, and now she was being prevented from maintaining the skills that had made the violation possible in the first place. It was a bureaucratic catch-22 that seemed designed to ensure she could never fly again. But on a Tuesday morning in March, everything changed with a single phone call. Sarah was processing a shipment of radio batteries when her supervisor, Master Sergeant Collins, returned to her office to find Sarah staring out the window, the phone still in her hand. "Martinez, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay?" "Ma'am, I think I'm being recalled to Washington. Something about new information regarding my case in Afghanistan." Master Sergeant Collins studied Sarah with the practical assessment of a senior NCO who'd seen enough military careers to recognize the signs of significant change. "Martinez, in my experience, when the Pentagon calls personally, it's either very good news or very bad news. Given that you're still holding the phone like it might explode, I'm guessing you don't know which one it is." Sarah managed a weak smile. "No, ma'am, I really don't." The flight from Kuwait to Washington gave Sarah 18 hours to contemplate the implications of Colonel Thompson's phone call. She'd spent so long accepting her exile as justified punishment that the possibility of vindication felt surreal, like a reprieve that might be withdrawn at any moment. The Pentagon was exactly as intimidating as she'd expected: vast corridors lined with portraits of military leaders. Conference rooms where decisions affecting millions of people were made daily, and an atmosphere of barely contained urgency that made her warehouse duties seem trivial by comparison. Colonel Rebecca Thompson turned out to be a compact woman with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone who'd earned her position through competence rather than politics. Her office was functional rather than decorative, dominated by maps, briefing charts, and stacks of reports that suggested someone who preferred substance to ceremony. "Specialist Martinez, thank you for coming. I know this must be confusing, but I want to explain exactly what's happened and why you're here." Colonel Thompson gestured to a chair across from her desk. "The investigation into your Afghanistan mission was technically correct, but strategically incomplete. You did violate established procedures, but those violations occurred in the context of a tactical situation that no one fully understood at the time." She opened a thick folder that Sarah recognized as her personnel file, but it was much thicker. Then she remembered someone had been adding documentation. "The capture of Ahmed Hassan has provided us with intelligence about Taliban operations that changes our understanding of several engagements from your deployment period. Your supply mission to Bravo Company wasn't just a life-saving emergency flight. It was an unintentional but devastating counterattack against a coordinated enemy operation." Colonel Thompson pulled out a map of the Coast Province, marked with positions and movement arrows that showed the scope of the Taliban operation. Hassan's forces had been positioning themselves for what they called Operation Desert Falcon, a coordinated series of attacks designed to capture American prisoners and demonstrate Taliban capability. Bravo Company was the primary target, chosen specifically because intelligence indicated they were running low on supplies. Sarah studied the map, seeing for the first time the larger context of her emergency flight. What had seemed like a straightforward resupply mission was actually the pivot point of a major enemy operation. According to Hassan's debriefing, the success of your mission forced the Taliban to abort not just the attack on Bravo Company, but 3 other planned operations in the region. The psychological impact of a failed ambush against a supposedly weakened American unit caused significant discord among Taliban commanders. The briefing continued for 2 hours, with Colonel Thompson laying out intelligence reports, tactical analyses, and strategic assessments that painted Sarah's single night of flying as a turning point in regional operations. It was both vindicating and overwhelming validation that her actions had been tactically sound, but also recognition that the consequences had been far larger than she'd ever imagined. Specialist Martinez, based on this new intelligence, the Army has concluded that your actions that night were not just appropriate, but exemplary. You demonstrated tactical judgment, technical skill, and leadership under extreme pressure. The investigation that resulted in your reassignment was based on incomplete information and an overly narrow interpretation of regulations. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that her actions were finally being recognized. Anger that it had taken 6 months and a Taliban commander's confession to achieve that recognition. Ma'am, what about Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's concerns about setting precedent? About encouraging others to exceed their authorized duties. Colonel Thompson's expression hardened slightly. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's concerns were noted and evaluated. However, the Army has concluded that discouraging tactical initiative in combat situations poses a greater risk to mission success than encouraging measured risk-taking by qualified personnel. The words were diplomatic, but Sarah understood their implications. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's investigation had been not just wrong, but counterproductive. In attempting to prevent future violations of procedure, he'd created a climate that discouraged exactly the kind of thinking that won battles and saved lives. Specialist Martinez, you're being offered several options for your continued service. You can return to administrative duties with a clean record and full recognition of your Afghanistan service. You can apply for restoration to flight status with full medical reevaluation and updated training. Or you can accept a direct commission as a warrant officer and immediate assignment to an aviation unit. The choices were dizzying after 6 months of counting inventory in a Kuwait warehouse. Sarah had spent so long accepting her exile that the possibility of choice felt overwhelming. Ma'am, I need to ask about something. What happened to the soldiers? Who supported me during the investigation? Major Reynolds, Miguel Martinez, Captain Morrison? Major Reynolds received a letter of commendation for his leadership during the emergency. Sergeant Martinez was promoted and assigned to a special Operations Aviation Unit. Captain Morrison's supply issues were resolved, and Bravo Company received recognition for their performance during the Taliban operation. The news that her supporters had ultimately been rewarded rather than punished lifted a weight from Sarah's shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The fear that her actions had damaged their careers had been almost worse than the damage to her own. Ma'am, I'd like to return to flight status. Colonel Thompson nodded as if she'd expected that answer. The medical board will need to reevaluate your flight physical, but given the circumstances of your original disqualification and your demonstrated performance under stress, I don't anticipate any problems. Your tremor appears to have been stress-related rather than indicative of any permanent impairment. The next week was a whirlwind of medical examinations, flight evaluations, and administrative processing. The flight surgeon who examined Sarah was Dr. Patricia Newman, a woman who'd spent her career studying the intersection of medicine and aviation performance. Specialist Martinez, I've reviewed your original medical files, and I want to be clear about something. The tremor that originally disqualified you from flight status was documented as minor and intermittent. In retrospect, it appears to have been related to stress and fatigue rather than any underlying neurological condition. Dr. Newman ran Sarah through a series of tests that evaluated everything from hand-eye coordination to stress response. The tremor was still present, but it was slight and didn't interfere with her ability to operate controls smoothly and precisely. More importantly, your performance during the Afghanistan mission demonstrated that you can maintain excellent aircraft control under extreme stress. That's not something we can test in a clinical setting, but it's probably the most relevant indicator of your flight fitness. The flight evaluation was conducted at Fort Rucker, where Sarah had originally trained as a pilot. Returning to the familiar training environment was surreal. She'd left as a student pilot with unlimited potential, and she was returning as someone who'd been tested by combat and found worthy. Chief Warrant Officer 4 Michael O'Brien was her evaluating pilot, a Vietnam veteran who'd been flying helicopters longer than Sarah had been alive. He had the weathered appearance of someone who'd seen every possible aviation emergency and the calm demeanor of someone who'd survived them all. "Martinez, I've read your file, and I've read the after-action reports from your Afghanistan mission. What I want to know is what you learned from the experience." The question was more complex than it seemed. Sarah had learned about military politics, about the difference between following procedures and accomplishing missions, about the cost of initiative in bureaucratic organizations. But she suspected that wasn't what Chief O'Brien was asking about. "Sir, I learned that flying is about more than just aircraft control. It's about making decisions with incomplete information, accepting responsibility for those decisions, and being willing to live with the consequences." She paused, thinking about the months in Kuwait. "I also learned that sometimes doing the right thing has costs that you don't expect and can't control." Chief O'Brien nodded, then spent the next 2 hours putting Sarah through every emergency procedure he could think of. Simulated engine failures, hydraulic malfunctions, auto-rotation landings, confined area operations, everything that could go wrong with a helicopter and everything a pilot needed to know to handle it. Sarah's performance was solid, her skills returning quickly despite the months away from flying. But more importantly, she felt the return of something she'd almost forgotten, the pure joy of flying well, of solving complex problems with skill and precision, of being exactly where she belonged. "Martinez," Chief O'Brien said as they finished, "the evaluation, you fly like someone who's been tested. That's not something we can teach in flight school. You've got good hands, good judgment, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever comes up." The formal restoration of Sarah's flight status came with orders assigning her to the 1st Aviation Regiment at Fort Riley, Kansas. It wasn't Special Operations Aviation, but it was a line unit with a real mission and the opportunity to use her skills in service of something larger than inventory management. The night before leaving Washington, Sarah called her father in Tucson to tell him about the changes in her career. Roberto Martinez listened quietly as she explained the investigation, the exile, the recall, and the restoration of her flight status. "Mia," he said when she finished, "I told you that the difference between fixing something and breaking it is paying attention. But there's something else. Sometimes you have to break the wrong thing to fix the right thing." Sarah understood. Her violation of procedures had broken the wrong thing, military regulations designed to prevent unauthorized actions, but it had fixed the right thing, the tactical situation that would have resulted in American casualties. "Papa, I'm going to be flying again. Real missions, not just emergencies." "Good. You were born to fly, Mia." It just took the Army a while to remember that. As Sarah prepared for her new assignment, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from administrative specialist to combat pilot to warehouse supervisor and back to aviation. It had been a circuitous route, marked by setbacks and victories, but it had led her to exactly where she needed to be, the woman who would report to Fort Riley was different from the one who'd been exiled to Kuwait. She'd been tested by combat, proven by crisis, and tempered by adversity. She'd learned that sometimes the most important missions came disguised as procedural violations, and that sometimes the greatest victories required accepting the possibility of career-ending defeat. But most importantly, she'd learned that being just the secretary had never been about her job description. It had been about how others saw her role and how she'd temporarily accepted their limitations as her own. The flight through enemy territory hadn't changed who she was. It had revealed who she'd always been. Fort Riley, Kansas, spread across the prairie like a testament to American military history. Its red brick buildings and perfectly maintained parade grounds, speaking to more than a century of soldiers who'd trained there before deploying to conflicts around the world. Sarah Martinez arrived on a crisp October morning, her orders directing her to report to the 1st Aviation Regiment's headquarters building, where she would begin the next chapter of a career that had taken more turns than a mountain road. Colonel David Park, the regiment commander, was a Korean War veteran's son who'd built his career on the principle that good leaders took care of their soldiers first and worried about regulations second. He greeted Sarah in his office, which was decorated with photographs of helicopters from every era of Army aviation, from Korean War era H-13s to the latest variants of Black Hawks and Apaches. "Chief Martinez," he said, using her new rank of Chief Warrant Officer that had come with her restoration to flight status. "I've read your file, and I have to say it's one of the more interesting personnel records I've encountered. Your Afghanistan mission has become something of a case study at the Command and General Staff College." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of pride and embarrassment. She'd saved lives and disrupted enemy operations, but she'd also become the subject of academic discussions about military decision-making and the balance between initiative and discipline. "Sir, I hope the case study reaches the right conclusions." The conclusion it reaches is that tactical competence matters more than administrative compliance, and that good soldiers find ways to accomplish the mission regardless of obstacles. Colonel Park gestured to a chair. "What it also concludes is that the Army needs to do a better job of recognizing and developing that kind of initiative rather than punishing it." Fort Riley's mission included training helicopter pilots for deployments worldwide, providing aviation support for the Big Red 1 Infantry Division, and maintaining readiness for rapid deployment anywhere American forces might be needed. It was real flying with real consequences, exactly what Sarah had been hoping for since her medical clearance had been restored. Her first assignment was as a standardization instructor pilot responsible for training and evaluating other aviators in the regiment. It was a position that required not just flying skills, but the ability to teach, assess, and develop other pilots, a natural progression for someone whose Afghanistan experience had demonstrated both technical competence and sound judgment under pressure. The other pilots in the regiment initially treated Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Her story had spread through the Army aviation community, growing in the telling until some versions bore only passing resemblance to the actual events. Some stories had her flying through heavy combat, others had her landing under direct fire, and one particularly creative version had her single-handedly defeating an entire Taliban battalion. "Ma'am," said Captain Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the Navy doctor from Bagram, during Sarah's first squadron meeting, "we've all heard stories about Afghanistan, but we'd like to hear the real version from you." Sarah looked around the room at a dozen aviators, ranging from fresh-faced warrant officers on their first assignments to senior pilots with multiple combat deployments. They were professionals who understood the difference between legend and reality, and they deserved a truth rather than an embellished war story. "The real version is that I was an administrative specialist who happened to be pilot qualified, and when no other pilots were available for an emergency mission, I was given the chance to fly it. I did my job, the crew did their jobs, and the soldiers on the ground did their jobs. Everyone came home alive, which is the only measure of success that really matters." Chief Warrant Officer 3 Marcus Johnson, a pilot with 2 Afghanistan deployments under his belt, nodded approvingly. "Ma'am, that's the kind of answer that tells us everything we need to know about how you approach flying. Mission first, ego second." Sarah's reputation as an instructor was built not on her single night of combat flying, but on her ability to teach complex procedures clearly and her insistence that her students understand not just how to execute maneuvers, but why those maneuvers worked and when they should be used. She'd learned from her own experience that emergencies rarely announce themselves with clear instructions and adequate preparation time. The most important skill you can develop, she told her students during emergency procedures training, is the ability to make good decisions with incomplete information under time pressure. Everything else, stick and rudder skills, systems knowledge, procedures, all of that is just preparation for the moment when you have to improvise a solution to a problem no one anticipated. Her training philosophy was influenced by her own experience of being forced to rely on half-remembered procedures and instinctive aircraft control during her Afghanistan mission. She emphasized practical problem-solving over rote memorization, adaptability over rigid adherence to prescribed methods. 6 months into her assignment at Fort Riley, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Miguel Martinez, now Sergeant First Class Martinez, appeared at the flight line wearing the distinctive uniform of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers she'd once hoped to join. "Ma'am," he said with a grin that hadn't changed despite his promotion and new assignment, "I was in the area for some training, and I wanted to see how you were doing in your new job." They walked along the flight line, past the Black Hawks and Chinooks that were the tools of Sarah's new trade. The Kansas sky was vast and blue, unmarked by the mountains and dust of Afghanistan. But the aircraft were the same, and the mission of keeping soldiers alive remained constant. "Miguel, how are things with SOAR?" "Challenging, ma'am. We fly missions that would have seemed impossible a few years ago, in places I can't talk about, with people whose names I don't know. It's everything I hoped it would be when I first enlisted." He paused, watching a student pilot practice auto-rotation landings. "But I wanted to tell you something about that night in Afghanistan." Sarah braced herself for another retelling of the mission, another analysis of her decisions and their consequences. But Miguel's words surprised her. "Ma'am, I've flown with a lot of pilots since then. Special operations guys, test pilots, instructors with thousands of hours. And I can tell you that what you did that night wasn't just about flying skills, emergency procedures. It was about character." "Miguel, no ma'am, let me finish. Most people, when they're faced with a choice between following the safe path and doing what needs to be done, they choose safe. You chose what needed to be done, and you accepted the consequences without complaint. That's not something you can teach in flight school." Miguel's visit reminded Sarah that her Afghanistan mission had affected more people than just the soldiers of Bravo Company. It had influenced the careers and perspectives of everyone who'd been involved, creating ripple effects that continued to spread months after the original event. Captain Morrison, she learned, had been promoted to major and given command of a company in the 82nd Airborne Division. His experience with unconventional supply solutions had made him something of an expert on adaptive logistics, and he'd been invited to lecture at the Army War College about leadership in ambiguous situations. Major Reynolds had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned as the operations officer for a combat aviation brigade, where his experience with emergency decision-making had made him a valued mentor for younger officers facing their own impossible choices. Even Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the officer who'd investigated Sarah's mission, had been affected by the eventual revelation of its strategic significance. He'd quietly submitted a formal recommendation that military regulations be revised to provide clearer guidance for commanders facing emergency situations, acknowledging that rigid adherence to procedures could sometimes conflict with mission accomplishment. But perhaps the most significant change was happening in military training institutions, where Sarah's story was being used as a case study in leadership courses. Not the embellished versions that circulated through unofficial channels, but the real story of a qualified soldier who'd been willing to accept personal risk to accomplish a mission that needed doing. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to Captain Morrison, was a professor at the Command and General Staff college who'd incorporated Sarah's mission into her curriculum on military decision-making. She contacted Sarah to request an interview for a more comprehensive case study. Chief Martinez, what I find most interesting about your situation is that you made a tactical decision that had strategic implications, but you made it based on immediate humanitarian concerns rather than broader military objectives. Sarah considered the observation. Ma'am, at the time, I wasn't thinking about strategy or tactics. I was thinking about soldiers who needed supplies and wounded men who needed medical attention. Everything else was secondary. That's exactly my point. You prioritized the human element over the procedural element, and that prioritization turned out to be tactically and strategically sound. It suggests that sometimes the most effective military decisions are made by people who focus on taking care of soldiers rather than following regulations. The interview lasted 3 hours and covered everything from Sarah's initial training to her current assignment. But Dr. Morrison kept returning to the theme of leadership in ambiguous situations. She was developing a theory that the most effective military leaders were those who could balance competing priorities: mission accomplishment, soldier welfare, and institutional requirements, without losing sight of which priority should take precedence in any given situation. Chief Martinez, based on your experience, what advice would you give to young officers who might face similar situations? Sarah thought about the question for a long moment, remembering her own uncertainty that night in Afghanistan, the weight of making a decision that could save lives or end careers. Ma'am, I'd tell them that there's no perfect answer to impossible situations. You gather the information available, assess the risks and benefits, and make the best decision you can with what you know at the time. Then you accept responsibility for the consequences, whatever they might be. She paused, then added, but I'd also tell them that sometimes the most important decisions you'll make won't look like decisions at all. They'll look like emergencies that require immediate action. The key is being prepared to act when those moments arise. Dr. Morrison's case study was eventually published in the Military Review, the Army's professional journal, under the title Initiative and Responsibility: Leadership Lessons from Emergency Operations. It became required reading for officers attending the Command and General Staff College, ensuring that Sarah's story would influence military thinking for years to come. But Sarah's most significant contribution to military aviation came through her work as an instructor pilot at Fort Riley. Over the course of 2 years, she trained more than 60 pilots, each of whom carried forward the lessons she'd learned about balancing technical competence with tactical judgment. Warrant Officer Jennifer Kim was one of Sarah's students, a recent flight school graduate who'd been assigned to her first operational unit. During a training flight focused on emergency procedures, Kim asked the question that Sarah had been expecting since she'd started teaching. Ma'am, during your mission in Afghanistan, how did you know you were making the right decision? Sarah had been asked variations of this question dozens of times, by students, by fellow instructors, by researchers studying military decision-making. Her answer had evolved over time, becoming more nuanced as she'd gained perspective on the experience. I didn't know I was making the right decision, she replied, guiding the helicopter through a practice auto-rotation. I knew I was making the necessary decision. Sometimes that's the same thing, sometimes it isn't. The key is being willing to live with the consequences either way. She demonstrated the auto-rotation landing, setting the helicopter down gently in a designated training area. What I did know was that soldiers needed help, and I was qualified to provide that help. Everything else, regulations, career consequences, potential criticism, was secondary to that basic requirement. Warrant Officer Kim nodded, absorbing the lesson. Ma'am, how do you teach someone to make that kind of decision under pressure? You don't teach the decision, Sarah replied, taking the controls back and lifting off for another practice approach. You teach the skills that make the decision possible. Aircraft control, emergency procedures, situational awareness, risk assessment. When the moment comes that requires a difficult decision, those skills give you the confidence to act. Sarah's teaching philosophy was tested dramatically during a training exercise in her second year at Fort Riley. A simulated emergency turned into a real one when Warrant Officer Mike Stevens, one of her students, suffered an actual engine failure. During what was supposed to be a practice, a UTOROTATION. Sarah was flying in the instructor's seat, ready to take control if necessary, when Stevens' helicopter lost power at 800 feet above the Kansas prairie. It was every flight instructor's nightmare, student pilot, facing a real emergency with limited experience and no opportunity for a second chance. "I've got the aircraft," Sarah said calmly, taking control as Stevens' hands froze on the controls. But instead of completing the auto-rotation herself, she kept her hands light on the controls and talked Stevens through the procedure. "Mike, you know this procedure. We've practiced it 50 times. Lower the collective, adjust the airspeed, find your landing spot. You can do this." Stevens' voice was tight with fear, but he followed Sarah's instructions, managing the helicopters. Descent toward an open field that looked barely large enough for a safe landing. Sarah was ready to take complete control at any moment, but she recognized that Stevens needed to complete this emergency himself to become the pilot he was capable of being. "Flare now, Mike. Easy on the collective. Let the helicopter settle." The landing was harder than ideal, but within acceptable parameters. The helicopter touched down in the designated emergency landing area, and Stevens sat motionless for a moment, processing what had just happened. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I can't believe I just did that." "Mike, you didn't just do that, you did it well. You managed a real emergency with good judgment and solid technique." Sarah began the post-landing procedures, securing the helicopter for recovery. That's what training is for, so that when something real happens, you're ready for it. The incident became another teaching tool for Sarah, demonstrating to her students that emergencies were survivable with proper training and calm decision-making. But it also reinforced her belief that the most important thing she could give her students wasn't just technical knowledge, but confidence in their ability to handle whatever situations they might face. Word of Sarah's instructional abilities spread beyond Fort Riley, and she began receiving requests to conduct training at other installations. The 1st Aviation Regiment became known for producing pilots who were not just technically proficient, but tactically sound and capable of making good decisions under pressure. Colonel Park, the regimental commander, called Sarah into his office. On a Friday afternoon in her second year at Fort Riley, the meeting had been scheduled as a routine performance counseling session, but Sarah could tell from his expression that something more significant was on his mind. "Chief Martinez, I've received some interesting phone calls about you recently. It seems that several units are requesting your services as an instructor, and the aviation branch is considering some assignments that would make use of your unique experience and demonstrated teaching ability." Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that accompanied major career developments. "Sir, what kind of assignments?" "The Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base is looking for an Army instructor pilot to work on joint helicopter development programs. The Special Operations Aviation Regiment has requested you for an instructor position at their Advanced Training Unit. And the Command and General Staff College has asked if you'd be interested in a teaching position focused on leadership and decision-making." The options represented 3 completely different career paths: test flying, special operations, or academic instruction. Each would utilize different aspects of her experience and skills, and each would require her to leave the line unit flying that had been so satisfying at Fort Riley. "Sir, those are all interesting opportunities. What's your recommendation?" "Colonel." Park leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with the assessment of a commander who'd learned to recognize potential in his subordinates. Chief Martinez, my recommendation is that you choose based on where you think you can make the biggest difference. You've already proven that you can fly helicopters well and teach other people to fly them well. The question is what you want to do with those abilities. That evening, Sarah walked the flight line at Fort Riley, watching student pilots practice night flying operations under the guidance of her fellow instructors. The Kansas sky was clear and star-filled, unmarked by the dust and smoke of combat zones, but the mission remained the same: training pilots who might someday face the same kind of impossible decisions she'd confronted in Afghanistan. She thought about the phone call from the Pentagon that had changed her life, the investigation that had almost ended her career, the warehouse in Kuwait where she'd counted inventory while her skills atrophied. All of it had led to this moment, this choice between different ways of continuing to serve. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Sarah realized that her most significant contribution hadn't been the single night of flying through enemy territory, but the months and years of teaching other pilots to be ready for their own impossible moments. Her legacy wouldn't be measured in missions flown or battles won, but in the capabilities she'd developed in the people she'd trained. She would stay at Fort Riley, continuing to train the next generation of Army aviators, carrying forward the lessons learned from a night when just the secretary had become exactly the pilot her soldiers needed her to be. 3 years later, the auditorium at Fort Rucker was packed with newly graduated helicopter pilots, their shiny warrant officer bars reflecting the stage lights as they waited for the keynote speaker to begin the ceremony that would mark their transition from students to operational aviators. Chief Warrant Officer 4 Sarah Martinez stood at the podium, looking out at faces that reminded her of her own graduation day, confident, nervous, eager to begin the careers they'd trained for. "When I was sitting where you are today," she began, "I thought I knew exactly what my career would look like. I was going to fly special operations missions, test the limits of what helicopters could do, and maybe someday become the kind of pilot that other pilots talked about with respect." The audience was attentive but relaxed, probably expecting the standard graduation speech about service and dedication and the proud traditions of Army aviation. Sarah had given this speech before, but today felt different somehow, more significant. "What I didn't know was that the most important mission of my career would come when I wasn't even supposed to be flying. That the skills I'd learned in this very building would be tested not during a planned operation, but during an emergency that no one had anticipated." She told them about Afghanistan, about the night when just the secretary had piloted a Black Hawk through enemy territory. But more importantly, she told them about the years that followed the investigation, the exile, the restoration, and the eventual recognition that sometimes the most significant achievements come disguised as career disasters. "The lesson isn't that you should violate regulations or ignore procedures," she said, watching their faces as they processed the implications of her story. "The lesson is that you should be so well trained, so competent, and so confident in your abilities that when the impossible situation arises, and it will arise, you're ready to do what needs to be done." After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Park, Colonel Park's daughter and a recent graduate of the Command and General Staff College. She'd been assigned to the Pentagon's aviation branch and was working on policy changes designed to encourage the kind of tactical initiative that Sarah's story had exemplified. "Ma'am, I wanted to tell you that the case study based on your Afghanistan mission has become required reading for all field-grade aviation officers. More importantly, it's influenced the development of new guidance that gives commanders clearer authority to make emergency decisions without fear of investigation." Sarah nodded, feeling a satisfaction that was different from the immediate gratification of successful flying. This was the deeper satisfaction of institutional change, of knowing that future soldiers might face fewer bureaucratic obstacles when trying to save lives. "Jessica, that's good to hear. But the real test will be whether commanders are willing to use that authority when it matters," Ma'am, I think they will. Your story has become part of Army culture now. Every aviation officer knows about the secretary who flew through enemy territory, and they understand what it means about initiative and responsibility. 5 years later, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, forwarded through multiple military mail systems before reaching Sarah at her new assignment as the Chief of Aviation Training at Fort Rucker. She'd been promoted to Chief Warrant Officer 5 and given responsibility for developing the curriculum that would train the next generation of Army pilots. The letter was from Captain Lisa Morrison, formerly Specialist Morrison, one of the wounded soldiers Sarah had evacuated from Afghanistan. She'd left the Army after her recovery, completed college on the GI Bill, and was now a civilian helicopter pilot working for a medical evacuation service in Colorado. Ma'am, the letter read, I wanted you to know that every time I fly a medevac mission, I think about that night when you came to get us. Not because it was dramatic or heroic, but because it showed me what it means to be a professional pilot. You didn't fly that mission for glory or recognition. You flew it because soldiers needed help and you were qualified to provide it. The letter continued with updates on other members of Bravo Company, some still serving, others who'd returned to civilian life, all of them carrying forward the memory of a night when someone had been willing to risk her career to bring them home safely. I've trained 6 new pilots in the past year, Lisa wrote, and I tell every one of them about you. Not the legend that's grown up around the story, but the real version about a qualified pilot who was ready when her moment came, and who accepted the consequences of doing what needed to be done. Sarah filed the letter in a growing collection of correspondence from soldiers whose lives had been touched by her Afghanistan mission. Some were from people she directly helped, others from soldiers who'd been inspired by her story to take their own initiatives in impossible situations. 10 years later, the Military Aviation Hall of Fame induction ceremony was held at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, attended by aviation legends from every service and era. Sarah Martinez, now retired from active duty and working as a civilian flight instructor, sat in the audience watching her former student, now Colonel Jennifer Kim, receive recognition for her contributions to helicopter safety and pilot training. In her acceptance speech, Colonel Kim credited Sarah with teaching her the most important lesson of her career, that technical competence is just the foundation. What matters is your willingness to use that competence in service of something larger than yourself. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by Dr. Robert Martinez, no relation, a historian from the Army War College, who was writing a comprehensive study of leadership in combat situations. He'd been researching Sarah's story for months, interviewing everyone involved and analyzing the long-term implications of her Afghanistan mission. Ma'am, what strikes me most about your story is how it's continued to influence people years after the original event. I've interviewed dozens of officers who've made similar decisions in difficult situations, and almost all of them cite your example as giving them the confidence to act. Sarah considered the observation. Over the years, she'd received hundreds of letters from soldiers who'd been inspired by her story, but she'd never fully grasped the cumulative impact of those individual decisions. Doctor, I think you're giving me too much credit. I made one decision on one night. Everything else has been done by other people. Ma'am, that's exactly the point. Leadership isn't about making one perfect decision. It's about making decisions that enable other people to make their own good decisions. Your willingness to risk your career for your soldiers gave permission for others to take similar risks when their soldiers needed them. The conversation continued over dinner at a restaurant near the museum, with Dr. Martinez explaining how Sarah's story had become part of a broader cultural shift in military thinking. The rigid adherence to procedures that had characterized earlier eras was giving way to a more flexible approach that valued tactical judgment and mission accomplishment. Ma'am, there's something else you should know. The Army is developing a new leadership course for senior warrant officers, and they've asked me to recommend someone to head the program. Someone whose experience demonstrates the kind of thinking they want to encourage. Sarah understood the implication. At 62, she'd planned to spend her remaining years teaching civilian pilots and enjoying the quiet satisfaction of retirement. But the military was offering her one more chance to influence the development of future leaders. 15 years later, the cemetery at Arlington National Cemetery was quiet on the spring morning when Sarah Martinez, now 87 and using a wheelchair due to a stroke that had ended her flying career, but not her sharp mind, attended the funeral of Major General Miguel Martinez. He'd risen through the ranks of Special Operations Aviation to become one of the Army's most respected helicopter commanders before dying peacefully in his sleep at age 70-9. At the graveside service, Sarah listened to eulogies that described Miguel's distinguished career, his contributions to aviation safety, and his mentorship of countless young pilots. But she remembered him as the crew chief who'd believed in her abilities when everyone else saw only just the secretary. After the service, she was approached by Brigadier General Lisa Morrison. Formerly the wounded specialist Sarah had evacuated from Afghanistan. She'd returned to military service after college, become a pilot herself, and was now responsible for all Army aviation training. "Ma'am," General Morrison said, "I wanted to tell you something that Miguel shared with me before he died. He said that the most important thing about that night in Afghanistan wasn't that you flew the mission. It was that you were ready to fly it." Sarah nodded, understanding the distinction. Preparedness, maintaining skills, studying procedures, staying current on techniques was what had made the emergency mission possible. The flying itself had been routine. The readiness to fly had been the real achievement. "Lisa, what's the current state of Army aviation training?" "Ma'am, it's focused on exactly the principles you developed during your teaching years. Technical competence, tactical judgment, and the confidence to act when action is required. Every pilot we graduate learns about the secretary who flew through enemy territory, and they understand what it means about being ready for their moment." As Sarah was driven home from the cemetery, she reflected on the long arc of her career and its aftermath. The single night that had defined her reputation had been followed by decades of teaching, mentoring, and institutional change that had influenced thousands of soldiers. The tremor in her left hand had never completely disappeared, but it had never prevented her from accomplishing anything that mattered. The investigation that had nearly ended her career had eventually led to policy changes that made similar situations less likely to result in punishment. The exile to Kuwait had given her perspective on the difference between temporary setbacks and permanent defeat. Most importantly, the label of just the secretary had taught her that other people's perceptions of your capabilities were less important than your own knowledge of what you could accomplish when circumstances demanded it. 20 years later, dedication ceremony for the Martinez Aviation Leadership Center at Fort Rucker was attended by hundreds of current and former military aviators representing every generation of Army helicopter pilots since Vietnam. Sarah Martinez, now 92 and one of the last surviving pilots from her era, sat in the front row as speakers described the impact her career had had on military aviation. The building would house the Army's premier leadership development program for aviation officers, combining technical training with decision-making exercises based on real-world scenarios. The centerpiece of the curriculum was a comprehensive case study program that used historical examples including Sarah's Afghanistan mission to teach future leaders about initiative, responsibility, and moral courage. General Patricia Collins, the Army's Chief of Staff and formerly the Master Sergeant who'd supervised Sarah in the Kuwait warehouse, delivered the keynote address. "Chief Martinez represents the best of what we try to develop in our soldiers' technical competence, moral courage, and the wisdom to know when regulations serve the mission and when the mission must transcend regulations." After the ceremony, Sarah was interviewed by a young military journalist who'd grown up hearing stories about the secretary who'd become a legend. The journalist's questions were thoughtful and well-researched, but they focused on the dramatic elements of the story, rather than its deeper lessons. "Ma'am, looking back on your career, do you ever regret the decision to fly that mission in Afghanistan?" Sarah smiled at the question she'd been asked hundreds of times over the decades. Her answer had evolved over the years, becoming more nuanced, as she'd gained perspective on the long-term implications of that single night. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that soldiers were in a situation where someone had to violate procedures to save their lives. I regret that the system initially punished initiative rather than celebrating it." She paused, looking out at the flight line where student pilots were practicing the same procedures she'd mastered decades earlier. "But I don't regret making the decision to fly. That night, soldiers needed help, and I was qualified to provide it. Everything else, career consequences, investigations, recognition, was secondary to that basic responsibility." The journalist nodded, scribbling notes. "Ma'am, what advice would you give to young soldiers who might face similar situations?" "Be ready. Study your profession, maintain your skills, understand your responsibilities. When the moment comes that demands more than your job description requires, you'll be prepared to meet it." Sarah gestured toward the training aircraft visible through the window. "And remember that sometimes the most important thing you'll ever do will come disguised as routine duty that suddenly becomes anything but routine." As the sun set over Fort Rucker, Sarah Martinez watched student pilots practice night flying operations, their helicopters moving across the Alabama sky, like mechanical fireflies carrying the dreams and ambitions of another generation of aviators. Somewhere among them was the next person who would face an impossible decision and discover that they were capable of more than they'd imagined. The secretary who'd flown through enemy territory had become something more than a war story or a case study. She'd become a reminder that heroism often looked like ordinary people doing extraordinary things because their training, their values, and their commitment to others demanded nothing less. In the decades since that night in Afghanistan, the label, "just the secretary," had been transformed from a dismissive description into a badge of honor, a reminder that in the military, everyone was a warrior first, and their primary job was to accomplish the mission and take care of their people. Regardless of what their official duties might say, the Black Hawk that had carried supplies to Bravo Company had long since been retired from service, but its legacy lived on in every helicopter that flew difficult missions, every pilot who made hard decisions under pressure, and every soldier who understood that sometimes the most important moments of your career came when you were willing to be more than your job description required. Sarah Martinez closed her eyes and listened to the sound of rotor blades beating against the night air, carrying another generation of pilots toward their own moments of truth, their own opportunities to discover who they really were when everything was on the line. The story that had begun with an emergency call for help had become something larger, a testament to the power of preparation, meeting opportunity, of competence intersecting with courage, and of ordinary people rising to meet extraordinary circumstances because their training and their values left them no other choice. Subscribe to Heroes Among Us, where silence is never forgotten. Sergeant Patricia Collins approached with an expression that mixed confusion and concern. Master Sergeant Collins was a career logistics specialist who ran the warehouse with mechanical precision, but she'd never shown any particular interest in Sarah's background or qualifications. "Martinez, I need you in my office. There's someone on the phone who wants to talk to you." Sarah followed her supervisor into the small office that overlooked the warehouse floor, wondering what kind of trouble she might have inadvertently created. Her administrative record had been spotless since arriving in Kuwait. No missed deadlines, no procedural violations, no reason for anyone to be calling about her performance. "Master." Sergeant Collins handed her the phone with an expression that suggested she wasn't entirely sure what was happening. It's someone from the Pentagon. They asked for you specifically. The voice on the other end of the line was crisp, professional, and completely unexpected. Specialist Martinez, this is Colonel Rebecca Thompson from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I need to ask you some questions about a mission you flew in Afghanistan approximately 6 months ago. Sarah's heart rate spiked. The investigation had been closed months ago, her counseling completed, her transfer processed. She'd assumed the matter was resolved, that she'd paid whatever price the system demanded for her moment of initiative. Ma'am, I'm not sure what additional information I can provide. The investigation was completed, and, Specialist Martinez, this isn't about the investigation. This is about something else entirely. Are you familiar with the name Ahmed Hassan? The name meant nothing to Sarah. She'd interacted with hundreds of people during her deployment: soldiers, contractors, interpreters, local nationals. Without additional context, she couldn't place anyone named Ahmed Hassan. No, ma'am, should I be? Ahmed Hassan was a Taliban commander operating in the Khost province. He was responsible for planning attacks against coalition forces, including the ambush that pinned down Bravo Company the night you flew your emergency resupply mission. Sarah felt something cold settling in her stomach. She'd known that Bravo Company had been under attack, but she'd focused on the medical and logistical aspects of the mission rather than the tactical situation that had created the emergency. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand the relevance. Specialist Martinez. 3 days ago, Ahmed Hassan was captured during a special operations raid. During his interrogation, he provided information about Taliban operations in your area of operations. According to Hassan, your supply mission that night disrupted a coordinated attack that was intended to overrun Bravo Company's position and capture American prisoners. The implications of Colonel Thompson's words slowly penetrated Sarah's confusion. She'd known that the supplies had helped Bravo Company maintain their position, but she hadn't understood that the position itself was part of a larger Taliban strategy. Hassan stated that his forces had been watching Bravo Company for weeks, waiting for them to run low on ammunition and medical supplies. The plan was to launch a final assault when the Americans were too weak to resist effectively. Your resupply mission gave them the resources they needed to repel the attack and hold their position until reinforcements arrived. Sarah sank into the chair behind Master Sergeant Collins' desk, struggling to process this new information. Ma'am, I was just delivering supplies. I didn't know about any larger tactical situation. That's exactly the point, Specialist Martinez. You made a tactical decision without having access to the full tactical picture. You improvised a solution to an immediate problem, and that solution happened to disrupt a major enemy operation. Colonel Thompson paused. According to Hassan's debriefing, the failure of the attack against Bravo Company forced the Taliban to abandon several other planned operations in the region. Your single mission had strategic implications that no one understood at the time. The revelation was overwhelming. Sarah had spent 6 months believing that she'd violated procedures to save 23 soldiers, which was significant enough. Now she was learning that her actions had disrupted enemy operations across an entire region, potentially saving dozens or hundreds of lives. Ma'am, why are you telling me this now? Because, Specialist Martinez, the military sometimes gets things wrong. The investigation that resulted in your reassignment was based on incomplete information and a narrow interpretation of regulations. What looked like a procedural violation at the time now appears to have been a tactically brilliant improvisation. Sarah felt tears threatening, a mixture of vindication and anger that she wasn't sure how to process. For 6 months she'd been counting inventory while believing that her career had been destroyed for one night of well-intentioned rule-breaking. Now she was learning that the same night had been a strategic victory that no one had recognized. Ma'am, what happens now? Now, Specialist Martinez, the Army has an opportunity to correct a mistake. You're being recalled to Washington for a comprehensive review of your case. Your medical status, your flight qualifications, your administrative. Reassignment, everything is being reconsidered in light of new information. The phone call ended with instructions to report to Andrews Air Force Base within 48 hours. But Sarah sat in the borrowed office chair for long minutes afterward, staring at the warehouse floor through the window. Months of routine had been shattered by 10 minutes of conversation, and she wasn't sure whether to feel hopeful or terrified. Master,